Hello, this is True Crime Nightmare, and this is episode 30 of this podcast. This case is a solved case of serial killer Robert Black. Robert Black was born in Scotland on the 21st of April 1947. He was born in a town called Grangemouth in Falkirk, Scotland. Robert Black was imprisoned for the kidnapping, rape and murder of 4 young girls. At the time of his arrest for the murders, he was already serving a life sentence in prison for the abduction and sexual assault of another young girl. Robert Black was the illegitimate child of a woman called Jessie Hunter Black. He did not know his father at all. Robert Black's mother had originally planned on having Robert adopted, but this did not happen. Robert Black was instead sent to a foster family. Jessie then moved away to live in Australia. Robert was known to be a difficult child, and he also had some antisocial behaviours when he was growing up, according to those who had known him at the time. He could be aggressive towards other children, and because of this, unsurprisingly, he did not have very many friends when he was growing up. It has also been reported that he would often throw tantrums and that he'd even vandalised school property on more than one occasion. He was, on the other hand, a victim of bullying as well. He was a known target to some children amongst his peer groups, but Robert Black himself would only really bully people that were younger and more vulnerable than himself when he was at school. Also, another problem that Robert Black had throughout his life was his poor hygiene. Despite his foster mother trying to stress how important it was to wash, shower regularly and to basically keep clean, Robert Black was not interested and would often neglect his personal hygiene. This continued throughout his life. He was known to be quite smelly at school and later on as an adult as well. At the age of 5, Robert Black appeared to develop a deep interest in young girls' bodies. It has also been said that at one point Robert Black had actually wanted to be a girl. He had said that he wanted to be a girl. He also became obsessed with his own body from a very young age. When Robert Black was living with his first foster family for a few years, people had started to notice that sometimes Robert would have unexplained bruises. This happened on a few occasions. When Robert Black was asked about the bruises, he said that he did not know how he had got them. It would eventually come to light that he had, on occasion, been beaten by his own foster mother. Robert Black was also a bedwetter as a child. He would get beaten every time by his foster mother when this happened. By the time Robert Black was 11 years old, both of his foster parents had died. He was placed with another family at this point. It was shortly after this that he committed his first known sexual assault. He had dragged a young girl into a public toilet and had fondled her. When his foster mother found out about this attack, she reported Robert to the police straight away. At the same time, she insisted that the boy was immediately removed from her home. Robert Black's next stop was a mixed-sex children's home on the outskirts of Falkirk in Scotland. It was shortly after he had arrived at the children's home that he apparently began exposing himself to young girls. Because of this and his previous offences as well as other issues, Robert Black was moved from the children's home to a place that had more dealings with troubled children. He was moved to a place called Red House Care Home, which was a high discipline, all-male establishment in Scotland. But apparently, whilst he was at the Red House Care Home, Robert Black was sexually abused by a male member of staff for over 3 years. He at this time attended the local grammar school, where he was known to be keen on playing football as well as swimming, but not much else. In 1963, when Robert Black was in his mid-teens, he left the Red House Care Home and moved into another boys' home, another care home, which was in Greenock in Scotland. He also got his first job at this point as a paid delivery boy for a local butcher. Also in 1963, Robert Black came across a 7-year-old girl who was out playing alone in the local park. He pretended to have some kittens nearby and said that he wanted to show them to her. She was lured away from the park to a deserted ex-air raid shelter close by. He then sexually assaulted the little girl. He was quickly identified and charged with this offence. However, nothing much really came of it other than he had to undergo assessments by a psychiatrist. This particular psychiatrist who examined him at the time said that he felt that the incident was an isolated one and he did not feel that Robert was likely to reoffend. The psychiatrist also said that he did not feel that any further treatment was needed in this case, so no action was really taken in relation to this assault. The courts did not order any prison time or any further treatment either, so sadly he was just allowed to go free. Shortly afterwards, Robert Black moved into lodgings in Grangemouth in Scotland, back where he used to live before, really. He took a room in a house that was owned by an elderly couple. At the same time, he got a full-time job at a local building supply company. He also started a relationship with a teenager who he had recently met at a local youth club. This relationship is thought to have been the only relationship that Robert Black had actually had with another person. Robert Black later said that he had asked the girl to marry him at one point, but that she had turned him down. Maybe it was his poor hygiene that made her not want to be with him, who knows. In 1966, Robert Black's elderly landlords discovered that he had molested their 9-year-old granddaughter on many separate occasions. All of the attacks had apparently happened at the house. The elderly couple evicted Robert Black from their home, but for some reason did not inform the police. Robert Black left his job shortly afterwards and moved out of the area. He was still free to carry on abusing young children. He moved a few miles away and once again found lodgings in a house. This time, the couple who owned the house had a 6-year-old daughter. The following year, the couple discovered that Robert Black had repeatedly molested their daughter. This time the police were notified. He was charged with indecent assault. He pleaded guilty in court and was sentenced to 1 year at Borstal. The Borstal that he attended in Scotland specialised in dealing with serious offences committed by young adults. In 1968, and just after a few months of leaving Borstal, Robert Black moved to England. He moved into a shared house in London. The house was close to King's Cross Station. For the next couple of years, he supported himself financially by taking on various jobs, often casual. He became a lifeguard at a local swimming pool. This was at a time when you did not need to attend extensive courses to become a lifeguard like you do today. It does not seem as though a police check was carried out either, because you would think that the type of offence that he had committed would not allow him to work near children or with children. But in the 1960s, rules of employment and police checks were not carried out anywhere near like they are today. He did not manage to keep this job for very long anyway, due to concerns about his behaviour towards young girls. It is thought to be around this time that Robert Black began collecting child pornography. He mainly collected magazines and photographs at first anyway. Later on he moved on to videos and other material that depicted child abuse. He also became very interested in photography and bought himself a camera. He was keen to photograph young children, particularly girls between the ages of 8 and 12. He would photograph them sometimes at local swimming pools. He kept most of the photographs in a locked suitcase along with all of his other pornographic material. Robert Black would sometimes go to the local pubs in the area. He became quite a good dance player by all accounts. He met a young Scottish couple at a local pub and he ended up renting a room from them. He was still actually living with them when he was arrested in July of 1990. Robert Black also bought himself a white van and began working as a delivery driver. In 1976, he got a permanent job as a van driver for a company called Poster Dispatch and Storage Limited in London. His new job included delivering posters and billboard advertisements to various different locations throughout the UK and continental Europe, and as well as Ireland as well. It would seem that his new employers considered Robert Black to be a good employee. He would often take on some of the long-distance trips that some of the other drivers, particularly those with young families, were not so keen to do. It was largely due to this delivery job that Robert Black was able to gain a lot of knowledge about different areas of the UK, Ireland and parts of Europe. He became very familiar with the road networks and places to stop along the way for a break while he was delivering. This would all become extremely useful knowledge to have once he began murdering children and dumping their bodies miles away from where he had abducted them. His first known murder victim was a young girl called Jennifer Cardy. She was 9 years old at the time of her murder. Jennifer was abducted, sexually assaulted before being murdered by Robert Black on the 12th of August 1981. His next victim was Susan Maxwell, who had been 11 years old. She had been living at Cornhill on Tweed on the English side of the Scottish border. Robert Black abducted the young girl on the 30th of July of 1982. She had been walking home after playing tennis in a town called Coldstream. She was last seen alive at about 4:30 in the afternoon of the 30th of July of 1982. She had been seen walking across the bridge over the River Tweed. It was later thought that she was abducted shortly after this sighting by Robert Black. Susan's body was found on the 12th of August 1982. She had been discovered by a lorry driver. The following year, another young girl was murdered, Caroline Hogg, who was only 5 years old, making her the youngest victim so far. She had been seen playing outside her home in Portobello in Edinburgh, Scotland. Caroline vanished at some point in the evening of the 8th of July of 1983. Caroline Hogg's body was found on the 18th of July 1983. She had been found in Twycross, which is about 310 miles away from where she had been abducted from. The police were not sure if all of the girls' murders were actually linked at first. However, after Caroline's body was found and after looking at some of the similarities, it was strongly believed that at least 2 of the murders were in fact linked. The police officers investigating the murders of both Susan Maxwell and Caroline Hogg now believed that these 2 murders were the work of the same person. Eventually, Jennifer Cardy's murder would also be linked, but that did not happen until many years later. In fact, her murder was not linked to Robert Black until 2009. The police also felt that due to Susan Maxwell and Caroline Hogg's bodies both being discovered some distance from where they had been abducted, a lorry driver or other form of long-distance driver was in all likelihood responsible for their murders. It was also believed that the crimes had been committed by an opportunist rather than someone stalking either girl before abducting them. Due to the many different locations involved with the children's murders and the abduction sites and the eventual disposal sites, it meant that 4 different police forces were now involved in trying to track the killer. An assistant chief constable called Hector Clark, who was in charge of the Northumbria police force at that time, was appointed the lead investigator, who was overall now in charge of the murder investigations. He quickly set about arranging an incident room to be organised in Northumberland and also in Leith police stations. They were briefed that all officers working on the investigation must liaise with all 4 police forces involved in the overall investigation of the child murders. Because this happened in the 1980s, all of the information was initially logged using a card index system. This particular system had caused so many problems, as well as potential oversights, before in the UK, during the hunt for Peter Sutcliffe, otherwise known as the so-called Yorkshire Ripper. But the police were keen not to let mistakes happen again. The card index filing system apparently contained hundreds of thousands of individual index cards on the Susan Maxwell case alone. So early on in the investigation, Hector Clark introduced computer technology into the case. Even though it was not anywhere near as advanced as it is today, and people were not always that familiar on how to actually use computers as such, it was felt necessary to do so. All of the relevant information needed to be collated, and the best way to do this was to use a computerised database, which would hopefully allow less chance of any sort of oversight into the murder investigation. Also, all 4 police forces involved would all be able to access the same information, which would help the investigation with any luck. The system that the police officers in this case used was called HOLMES. HOLMES stands for Home Office Large Major Inquiry System. The cost of, at the time, to set this system up back then in the 1980s was thought to have been about £250,000. By January 1987, all information relating to the murders had been entered into the database. Any new information that came in would also be added. This would help keep everyone working on the case updated as quickly as possible with any new details or suspects coming in. Robert Black's 4th known murder victim was a 10-year-old girl called Sarah Harper. Sarah had lived in Leeds in England when she had suddenly disappeared. She had just popped out on an errand to buy a loaf of bread at the local corner shop. This was in 1986. Sarah had gone to the shops at about 10 to 8 in the evening of the 26th of March 1986. The shop was only 100 yards away from the family home in Morley in Leeds. Sarah's body was discovered by a man out walking on the 19th of April 1986. She had been found floating in the River Trent near Nottingham, which is roughly 70 miles away from the place that she had last been seen at. At first, the police officer in charge of the Sarah Harper murder investigation had doubts about her case being linked to Susan Maxwell and Caroline Hogg's case. The officer in charge, Detective John Stainthorpe, gave an interview to the media whereby he stated that despite not being totally able to rule out a link, he felt that Sarah Harper's murder had more of a personal connection and that a local man was probably the killer. The detective felt that the killer had connections to Morley in Leeds, where Sarah had lived with her family. However, numerous similarities seemed to link the murders and that they needed to be looked into, so an open mind was definitely needed in this case. Sarah Harper had been about the same age as the other victims. She was also white. Sarah Harper was abducted from the north of England in Leeds, and her body was discovered many miles away, just like the other victims. Following Sarah Harper's murder, there were now 6 police forces involved in the hunt for the killer. Hector Clark maintained overall charge of the whole investigation, and Sarah Harper's murder was now formally linked to the other 2 cases. Jennifer Cardy was not linked to this series until many years later. A new headquarters was created in Wakefield, which is in West Yorkshire. On the 21st of April of 1986, the head of Scotland Yard's Criminal Investigations branch Philip Corbett, hosted a special meeting at Scotland Yard. The meeting was arranged so that lead officers working on the cases could discuss any strategies and any relevant updates and share them with each other. At the meeting, it was stressed once again how important it was to share information with fellow officers between all of the 6 forces that were by now working on the case. Senior officers from 16 police forces attended this meeting. At this stage, the murder inquiry had already cost over £1 million. Another outcome from the meeting was that the FBI were contacted with a request to complete a profile on the likely suspect. The FBI completed their profile in early 1988. A section of the profile that was made available was as follows, quote, "The abduction of the victims from a public area within walking distance of the victim's residence represents a desperate act by a man whose need for little children is greater than his fear of being exposed as a paedophile." The profile continued, he was relaxed and comfortable while buying the victim's favour in a public area because he spends a great deal of time in such places watching and seeking out young victims, unquote. This section of the profile report was based on the abduction of Caroline Hogg. The investigators working on the case used the Holmes database to try and find potential suspects. They concentrated on anyone who had convictions for serious sexual offences, as well as those that had previously been convicted of child abduction or attempted child abduction. They also looked at people convicted of indecent assault against children. The number of potential suspects came to over hundreds of thousands, and Robert Black was not on the list at all. The task force had only gone back 10 years from the 1982 murder of Susan Maxwell, so Robert's offences were not highlighted because he had committed his offences in the 1960s. In fact, Robert Black's only conviction had been in 1967. Further information on the profile of the killer from the FBI included the following, quote, "The suspect in all probability is a white male, aged between 30 and 40, and a loner. He would have an unkempt appearance and was not very well educated. He lived alone, motive was sexual, fixated with children, and he used child pornography, kept souvenirs from the victims, and probably took part in necrophilia with his victims' bodies. On the 23rd of April of 1988, an attempted abduction of a teenage girl occurred in Nottingham. It was not initially linked to the murder case. Because the victim was 15 years old and all of the murder victims had been between 5 and 11 years old, the cases were not linked at first. The lead investigator, Hector Clark, nor any of the other senior officers working on the murder cases had not been briefed on the failed abduction because of this. The victim was a 15-year-old girl called Teresa Thornhill. She looked younger than her years and was of a very slight build. Teresa had been at a social gathering at a local park, along with her boyfriend Andrew and some other teenagers as well. Teresa and Andrew had parted company to walk to their homes separately. Teresa later said that she had noticed a van which had appeared to be slowing down just ahead of her. Then suddenly the van stopped, the driver got out and started looking under the bonnet of the van. He then asked Teresa if she knew how to fix engines. Teresa told the man that she did not know how to fix engines, and she started to quickly walk away from him. The man then suddenly grabbed her and put his hand over her mouth and attempted to drag her into his van. However, Teresa fought back and managed to free herself. She also kicked and bit him. She also started screaming for help. Andrew, her boyfriend, who had only just walked away from her, heard the screams and the commotion and ran over to the van to help his girlfriend. The man got back in the van and quickly drove off. Teresa reported the attack to the police. She described the man as dirty, overweight and balding. She put his age at between 40 and 50 years old. No arrest was made at the time in relation to this case. Robert Black was finally caught in a place called Stowe in the Scottish borders. He had abducted a young girl from a residential area in broad daylight. The victim was a 6-year-old girl. Luckily, though, the abduction had been witnessed. A man called David realised he had just witnessed a neighbour's daughter being abducted. He took down the registration number of the van. He knew which house the girl lived at, so rushed over to tell the family what he had just seen. The mother of the little girl phoned the police. Within minutes, 6 police cars had arrived at the scene of the abduction. Unbelievably, as the witness was outside talking to the police, the van appeared again. The driver of the van was immediately stopped and he was handcuffed. When the police officers opened the back of the van, they noticed movement coming from what seemed to be a sleeping bag. The little girl was found tied up and gagged inside the sleeping bag in the back of the van. When the driver of the van, Robert Black, was taken to the local police station to be questioned about the abduction of the little girl, he told them that it was just a rush of blood to the head. He told the police that he had always liked little girls. He also told them that after he had picked her up, he had dropped off a parcel locally in relation to his work, and that he admitted he had sexually assaulted the girl at this just after this point. He insisted that he was going to let her go, and that's why he was going back to the residential estate. Robert Black was charged with kidnap and sexual assault. He was remanded in custody. The superintendent of the police force that captured Robert Black noted the similarities between the young girl's abduction and the unsolved child murders. He notified Hector Clark, who had overall control of the investigation into the child murders, and told him his suspicions about Robert Black. Hector Clark travelled from Wakefield, England, to Edinburgh in Scotland to interview Robert Black. Although Robert Black's answers were very brief to the many questions put to him, Hector Clark felt that he was in fact the killer that he had been looking for since 1982. The police searched the van and they discovered many incriminating items that could be used as evidence against Robert Black. They had found restraints, a hood, a camera, girls' clothing, a mattress and some sex toys in the van that Robert Black had been driving when he abducted the 6-year-old girl. The police also searched his room at the house he shared with his landlords. They found a large collection of child pornography. They also found a newspaper that had an article on the attempted abduction of Teresa Thornhill. Robert Black's defence lawyer ordered psychiatric tests to be carried out on his client. 2 reports were prepared by 2 different psychiatrists who had both examined Robert Black. They both noted his deviancy towards young children. Robert Black's lawyer tried to say that it had been an unplanned attack and he was going to release the girl. The lawyer also said that Robert Black accepted that he was a danger to children and he wished to undergo relevant treatment to try and overcome this problem. The judge, however, handed Robert Black a life sentence and said that he considered Robert Black to be an extreme dangerous person towards children. The judge went on to praise the quick response from the man who had witnessed the little girl's abduction. The man who had witnessed the abduction, David, who was called David, gave evidence and outlined just what he had seen that day. David, who was 53 at the time, was a retired postmaster. He had been cutting his grass in the front garden when the abduction happened. He said that he had noticed a blue transit van slow down and then stop just across the road from him. He went on to say that the driver of the van had got out of the vehicle just as a little girl, who David recognised, he passed by the van. David said that the man appeared to be cleaning the windscreen of his van. David carried on with his gardening and then looked across the road again just to see the little girls being sort of lifted off the pavement by the unknown man. He said he couldn't see properly what was happening because the van obscured his view, so he just noticed that her feet had sort of left the pavement really, and that she wasn't anywhere around. David went on to say that he noticed that the driver of the van was hastily trying to push something into the passenger side of the van. The driver had then quickly got back into the vehicle and had then driven off, and that there was no sign at all of the girl. Luckily, David had the presence of mind to take a note of the registration number, and having realised what he had probably just witnessed, he ran to the girl's home. The police were quickly called and arrived within a few minutes. For some reason, shortly afterwards, Robert Black returned to the scene where he was immediately arrested. One of the police officers who attended the scene turned out to have been the young girl's father, which must have been horrific. He was the officer who actually found her in the back of the van, tied up in the sleeping bag. How terrible that must have been, and how he must have also wanted to get the hold of the man responsible. At least, although severely traumatised, the young girl was rescued, due largely to very quick action by the very vigilant neighbour, as well as the police, who arrived very quickly on the scene. When Robert Black received his life sentence for this horrific crime. He said that he was going to appeal, but he later abandoned that idea. He was transferred to Peterhead Prison, which is in Scotland, to start serving his sentence. The police working on the unsolved child murder cases were still gathering evidence that would ultimately link Robert Black to 4 murders and another attempted abduction. When he was questioned about his attraction for young girls, he admitted that he had sexually assaulted more than 30 young girls between the late 1960s and the 1980s. He, however, did not offer very much in the way of evidence about any of these assaults. When he was asked about the murdered girls, he claimed to not know anything about the murders at all. The police were by this time starting to link up some of his work records as well as other evidence which would point to his involvement. They now had petrol receipts that placed him at not only the abduction sites but also the disposal sites. He still did not admit to having any involvement or even knowledge about the child murders, though. Hector Clark, however, was convinced Robert Black was the man that they had all been looking for so long. The police continued to investigate further to try and get as much evidence as possible against their prime suspect. They contacted his employers to get some more information on his work trips. They needed to tally up as many dates as possible. They would eventually find receipts and other paperwork that placed him at all of the scenes involved with the child murders. In December of 1990, they had enough evidence to arrest and charge him with 3 of the murders. His trial took place at Mook Hall in Newcastle, which is in England. The judge in this case was William Macpherson. Robert Black pleaded not guilty to all charges. He was not charged with the murder of Jennifer Cardy at this point due to lack of evidence. All of the incriminating evidence was presented to the jury and many witnesses were called to give evidence. Robert Black's defence lawyer claimed that his client was being used as a scapegoat to try and appease the failings and the frustrations of all the police that had been working on the murder cases. Robert Black did not testify at his murder trial. Also, the jury were aware of his conviction for the abduction and sexual assault of the 6-year-old girl. His lawyer instructed the jury not to let biased opinions cloud their judgment because of this insight, though. They were instructed to just look at the evidence presented at trial. The jury took 2 days to reach a verdict, but on the 19th of May 1994, they found Robert Black guilty of 3 counts of murder in relation to Susan Maxwell, Caroline Hogg and Sarah Harper. The jury also found Robert Black guilty of the attempted abduction of 15-year-old Teresa Thornhill. He was sentenced to 3 life sentences with a recommendation that he serve at least a minimum of 35 years. On passing sentence, Judge Macpherson described Robert Black as being the perpetrator of offences which are unlikely ever to be forgotten and which represent a man at his most vile. It was reported that Robert Black did not show a lot of reaction to the verdict and did not show any sign of remorse at any part during the trial or afterwards. He was taken to Wakefield Prison to serve this life sentence, or the 3 life sentences that he'd been given on top of the 1 life sentence that he already had. He was put into Wakefield Prison as a Category A prisoner. On the 22nd of September of 2011, Robert Black appeared in court once again. This time it was for the murder of Jennifer Cardy. The murder case was heard at Armagh Crown Court in Northern Ireland. Robert Black pleaded not guilty to the charge. However, there was evidence to show that Robert Black had been in Northern Ireland at the time of Jennifer's murder. Petrol receipts were used to prove he had in fact been there. A receipt was produced for the exact date that the little girl was abducted. His employment records were also produced to show that he was working in Northern Ireland at the time, delivering items for the company that he worked for. Nathaniel Carey, a forensic pathologist, testified during the trial for the prosecution. He noted that there were similarities between Jennifer's murder and that of Sarah Harper, who Robert Black had already been convicted of killing. On the 27th of October of 2011, he was once again found guilty of murder, this time in relation to his first known victim, Jennifer Cardy. He had an additional sentence of 25 years added on to his many life sentences. At this point, he was told that he would not be released from prison until he was at least 89 years old. He was by this time in his 50s. The killer has often been linked to other murders, but so far there has not been enough evidence to charge him with any of them. During his years in prison, he has been violently attacked on many occasions by fellow inmates. He had also never admitted to having any involvement with any murders, including the 4 that he has already been convicted of. The 4 murders that Robert Black was convicted of are as follows. Jennifer Cardy, who had been 9 years old when she was abducted, sexually assaulted and murdered on the 12th of August of 1981. She was last seen by her mother at 1:40 in the afternoon as Jennifer cycled to a friend's house in Bollingderry in County Antrim, which is in Northern Ireland. Jennifer did not make it to her friend's house. A few hours later, her bicycle was found less than a mile from her home. The bike had been covered with some branches and leaves in an attempt to hide it. It was also noted that the stand on the bike was down, which suggested that she had stopped for some reason. The area was searched, but no further evidence was found. 6 days later, Jennifer's body was discovered by 2 fishermen. Her body was in a reservoir near a lay-by in Hillsborough, which is in Northern Ireland, which was about 16 miles from her family home. A pathologist who examined the little girl's body noted signs of a sexual assault. She had died of drowning, and someone had attempted to strangle her prior to her drowning. She had been wearing a watch at the time of her death, and it had stopped at 5:40 in the afternoon, early evening. The location of where Jennifer's body had been found was fairly near to a major road network. It was thought that the killer would have probably been reasonably familiar with the area. The reservoir where Jennifer's body was found was near a route that was often used by long-distance lorry drivers or van drivers. Susan Maxwell was the second known victim of serial killer Robert Black. Susan lived at Cornhill on Tweed on the English side of the Anglo-Scottish border. She had been abducted on the 30th of July of 1982 as she was walking home from playing tennis in Coldstream, a distance of just under 2 miles from her home. She had last been spotted crossing the bridge and over the River Tweed, and it was felt that she had probably been abducted by Robert Black shortly afterwards. The next day, a search was carried out by the police. Search dogs were also used. 300 police officers had been drafted in to help with the search. A thorough search was conducted and many people were interviewed. Witnesses had come forward by then to say that a white van had been seen in the area at around about the same time that Susan had disappeared. 13 days after she had vanished, Susan Maxwell's body was found. She had been discovered by a lorry driver. She was in some undergrowth and was still wearing most of her clothes that she had been wearing when she disappeared. The exact date and cause of death could not be established due to the decomposition. Susan Maxwell had been bound and gagged. Her underwear had been removed and placed under her head. At the coroner's inquest, it was established that Susan Maxwell had been murdered shortly after her disappearance. It would later come to light that Susan Maxwell, although she was already probably dead, had been kept in Robert Black's work van for over 24 hours before her body was dumped. The police found out later that Robert Black's work and delivery schedule meant that he had driven to Edinburgh, then Dundee and finally Glasgow before driving to England the next day, where he then dumped the little girl's body just off of the A518 near Uttoxeter. Her body was found 264 miles away from where she had actually been abducted, and his work records proved that she had to have still been in his van while he was delivering to the cities in Scotland before driving to England the very next day for work purposes. Caroline Hogg was his next known victim. She was also the youngest victim at only 5 years old. Caroline had been playing outside close to her home at Beech Lane in Portobello in Edinburgh, Scotland. Portobello is a coastal suburb of Edinburgh. It was the 8th of July of 1983, and it was early in the evening when Caroline vanished. Her family noticed that she was not outside the home playing when they went to check on her at about 7:15 that evening. They immediately began checking and searching the local area. A young boy told her family that he had seen Caroline with a man on the nearby promenade. They searched the promenade but could not find any sign of the little girl. The family contacted the Lothian and Borders police to report Caroline Hogg missing shortly afterwards. A search party was quickly set up using 2,000 local volunteers and 50 members of the Royal Scots Fusiliers, as well as a number of regular police officers. They all covered a vast area, but no sign of Caroline Hogg was found. Caroline's disappearance was headline news across the whole of the UK. 9 known paedophiles living in the immediate area in Portobello were all quickly eliminated from the inquiry as the search continued. Many witnesses came forward. Some had seen an unkempt, balding man wearing glasses watching Caroline Hogg as she had played just outside her home. Caroline had apparently wandered off to a nearby fairground. She had been seen by a 14-year-old local girl called Jennifer Booth. Jennifer had seen Caroline sitting on a bench with a man. The older girl had overheard part of a conversation between the younger girl and the man. She told the police that she had heard Caroline say, quote, "Yes, please," unquote, to something the man had said to her. Then the man and Caroline had left the fairground holding hands. Another witness came forward to say that they had also seen Caroline with a man and that she had seemed frightened. Caroline Hogg's naked body was found in a ditch close to the M1 in Twycross in Leicestershire in England. The distance from Caroline's home to where her body was discovered is about 310 miles away. Also, the location of where Caroline's body was found is only 24 miles away from where Susan Maxwell's body had been found the year before. The precise cause of death in relation to Caroline's death could not be determined due to the extent of the decomposition. Insect activity at the scene suggested that Caroline's body had been placed there on or after the 12th of July, so a few days after she had gone missing. Robert Black had made a delivery to Bedworth, which was not far from the scene on the 12th of July. A reconstruction was made of the abduction and many witnesses came forward with sightings, or potential sightings anyway. It did not lead to an arrest, however. Robert Black's last known murder victim was 10-year-old Sarah Harper. Sarah went missing on the 26th of March of 1986. She had left her home in Morley, which is in Leeds, England, to go to the local corner shop, which was only about 100 yards from her home. It was shortly before 8 o'clock in the evening. She made it to the shop. The owner of the shop remembered seeing her there. She had bought a loaf of bread and some crisps. The shop owner also said that shortly after Sarah arrived at the shop, an unknown man entered the shop at roughly the same time. She also said that he had left shortly afterwards without actually buying anything. At this point, Sarah was at the counter paying for her shopping. Sarah Harper was last seen by 2 girls and they told the police that she had been walking in the direction of her home. When Sarah failed to return home by 8:20, Sarah's mother and Sarah's younger sister Claire went to look for her. However, there was no sign of her at all. The police were called soon after. The West Yorkshire Police Force immediately organised an extensive search of the local area to try and find the 10-year-old girl. Over 100 police officers were drafted in to help. Many had to have house-to-house inquiries were conducted across Morley and Leeds. Over 3,000 properties were searched by the police and 10,000 leaflets were quickly distributed to try and get as much information as they possibly could. The police also took many witness statements. 200 local people also volunteered to search for the little girl. Witnesses had passed on to the police as well that a white van had been seen in the local area at roughly the same time that Sarah Harper had vanished. On the 19th of April of 1986, almost 3 weeks after the last sighting of Sarah Harper, her body was found. A man had discovered Sarah's body, which had been partially dressed and bound and gagged, floating in the River Trent near Nottingham. This location is 71 miles away from where Sarah Harper had last been seen. An autopsy discovered that Sarah had died just a few hours after she had been abducted on the 26th of March. The cause of death was drowning. The autopsy also revealed that she had been sexually assaulted. Witnesses once again came forward after more appeals were made by the police and also by Sarah Harper's family. Someone reported that they had witnessed a stocky man who was also balding standing next to a van close to the River Suir. The River Suir leads into the River Trent, so the police took this eyewitness account quite seriously. However, no suspect came to light. Although over time many witnesses had come forward with information and sightings, no suspect at the time was known to the police. It was largely because of Robert Black's own mistake that he was eventually caught when he had abducted the 6-year-old girl in broad daylight in front of an eyewitness in a busy residential street. That was really his downfall. Thankfully, he did make a mistake, which I had no doubt saved other young girls from suffering the same fate as Jennifer Cardy, Susan Maxwell, Caroline Hogg and Sarah Harper. There were also other victims of Robert Black, the girls that he had molested before he moved on to murder, the attempted abduction of Teresa Thornhill as well. There will no doubt be others that have not come to light. It is hard to think about all of the suffering that such an evil, hateful man forced onto his victims, as well as the victims' family and their friends. Also, the communities that they lived in, they would have suffered, especially when Robert Black was still at large and he was free to roam and kill whenever he wanted. The attack on Teresa Thornhill as well would have left mental scars, no doubt. At least all 4 of his known murder victims' bodies were found after a relatively short time and were given back to their loved ones. Psychiatrists since his arrest have examined the killer and concluded that he had no capacity for empathy for his victims and he'd never shown any remorse. He did have a hard life at the beginning, no doubt. He did not know his father. In fact, he did not even have a name for his father. His mother also abandoned him and moved away forever to Australia. He had some bad experiences in foster care. He had been physically abused by his first foster mother. He had also allegedly been sexually abused, but in one of the care homes by a male employee. However, he himself went on to cause absolute devastation to so many people and did not appear to have any remorse for what he had done. Robert Black died in his prison cell in January 2016 at the age of 68. They believe it was a heart attack. He really was such an evil man. Hopefully the victims' families will now have some peace at least. Thank you very much for listening. The credits for this episode go to Wikipedia, www.dailyrecord.co.uk and www.crimeandinvestigation.co.uk. Thank you very much.